How do you make a plane that's invisible? Well, I'll be honest, I'm definitely not qualified to say, but here's Lockheed's Skunk Works' answer to that question, the F-117 Nighthawk. Now, I know what you're saying, that plane is very much visible, and if you're really smart you're saying that plane would be useless against an AI-controlled camera. But yes, you can see it. It's right there and it admittedly looks a little silly. But if you were a radar station and this Darth Vader looking fella flew by, you'd be none the wiser. In fact, the Nighthawk could fly by, bomb your military's command post, and disappear out of the country and you wouldn't have a clue. Well, aside from the bomb going off of course. Nicknamed the Nighthawk, the F-117 became not only one of the most feared aircraft in the world, undertaking missions on every major US operation from the tail end of the 80s until the early 2000s, but it's also widely regarded as the plane that saved Lockheed as a company. For nearly a decade, the erroneously named stealth fighter was in a league of its own, and to this day it has only recorded one combat loss, a shitshow deserving of a video on its own. So where did the need for a stealth aircraft come from? Why did Lockheed take a gamble on such an unorthodox design? And how did the Nighthawk become the invisible icon it's often thought of as today? Every facet of the Vietnam War would teach the United States valuable lessons in waging war, and the skies over the tumultuous former French colony would have a major impact on the path the Air Force would pursue in the coming decades. You see, in their dick-swinging contest against the Americans known as the Arms Race, the Soviets had gotten frighteningly good at building missiles, the Red surface-to-air missiles downing the presumed invincible U-2 spy plane, but more importantly here, dozens of heavy bombers on their way to bomb Vietnamese communism into submission. This was problematic, as, well, if your bombers keep getting shot down, clearly something needs to change. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, better known as DARPA, or the guys who laid part of the foundation for the downfall of humanity, would see the strength of the Second World's air defenses in Vietnam, as well as during the fourth installment of the Arab-Israeli Wars in the early 70s, and after several drinks, decided to try and find a way to build a plane those air defenses couldn't see. So in 1974, they created what is often erroneously known as Project Harvey, supposedly named after a 1940s play about a giant invisible rabbit of the same name as any good taxpayer-funded project should be, and invited several defense contractors to participate: Northrop, McDonnell Douglas, General Dynamics, Fairchild, and Grumman. Unsurprisingly, not everyone was as enthusiastic about invisible planes as DARPA, with Fairchild, General Dynamics, and Grumman essentially telling them to fuck off, while Northrop and McDonnell Douglas would present some ideas that warranted each receiving a $100,000 contract for further development. Now, given they would eventually build the F-117, you might be wondering where Lockheed is in all this, and to explain that, we're gonna have to cover some strange corporate history. By the mid-1970s, Lockheed had been very naughty, facing not only a bankruptcy, but several charges of bribery in multiple countries, the contractor being $2 billion in the red by the start of 1975. This story begins in the middle of the atomic age, however, when Lockheed started selling their F-104 starfighter to foreign customers, an elegantly titled aircraft playfully nicknamed the Missile with a Man in it. On the surface, Lockheed appeared to have a winner on their hands, selling hundreds to its allies over the next few years, but all was not as it seemed, and between acquiring the more morbid moniker of Widowmaker after a series of crashes, Lockheed had been secretly bribing foreign government officials to ensure the starfighter was adopted by their air forces. Because crime isn't real if you have enough money, Lockheed got away with bribing foreign governments until the 1970s, when their finances crashed through the floor. Even though they're better known for their military aircraft, Lockheed once had a successful line of civilian transports, and in 1970, after a 9-year hiatus from building passenger planes, introduced the L-1011 TriStar in partnership with Rolls-Royce, a trijet configured passenger plane that ended up being so successful that the British and American governments had to bail out the two companies that built them. The engines Rolls-Royce were producing for Lockheed's airliner design had skyrocketed in cost so hard it would give 2018 Venezuelan bread a run for its money, and by 1971, Rolls-Royce were bankrupt. Already being dominated in the commercial market by the similar DC-10, Lockheed now had no engines for their new transport, and typically, engines are important on planes, especially a plane intended to have 3. Faced with a triple-engined economic black hole, Lockheed would secure a loan from the US government in 1971 and an agreement with the Textron Corporation in 1974 to keep them afloat. But the government noticed that something was sketchy about Lockheed's foreign sales, and upon investigation, their bribery scheme, which had expanded to include the C-130 and L-1011, was exposed. Millions of dollars in bribes were revealed, and a number of senior Lockheed executives resigned in disgrace, but predictably, none of them would see the inside of a cell. The once mighty defense contractor was about as fucked as an OnlyFans model in Miami, and here they would take a gamble on an entirely new kind of aircraft. As it relates to the Lockheed bribery scandal, the Skunk Works had nothing to do with it. Aside from being the people who created the F-104, Lockheed was bribing people to buy. Despite this, head skunk Kelly Johnson almost retired out of disgust at Lockheed's corporate heads following the breaking of the story. However, in 1974, Skunk Works engineer Ed Martin would catch wind of DARPA's new project through contacts in the Pentagon, alerting Ben Rich and Kelly Johnson, and the Skunks sought an invite to the program. Given Lockheed hadn't built any combat aircraft since before DARPA was even founded, they hadn't really felt a need to invite Lockheed to participate. But unbeknownst to them, when it came to low RCS return aircraft, Skunk Works had been around the block more than a few times. Despite retiring in early 1975 and being replaced by Ben Rich, Kelly Johnson always had some sway at the CIA, and although he too was rightfully skeptical of invisible planes, Rich convinced Johnson to get the CIA to inform DARPA of their RCS experiments in the U-2, A-12, and D-21 programs. Taking a break from whatever nefarious antics they were up to, the CIA obliged, and DARPA were impressed by the research the Skunks had under their belts. But there was just one problem. DARPA was out of money. Facing potential dissolution due to Lockheed's financial woes, the Skunks scrounged together whatever money they could, and even with a fair share of skeptics, the Skunks would make several immense breakthroughs in the next year. How do you build a plane that's invisible to radar? By 1975, Dennis Overholser thought he had the answer: faceting. Over his years working at Skunk Works, Overholser had spent many hours discussing with his mentor and boss, Bill Schroeder, the idea of building a plane out of a minimal number of flat surfaces, oriented in such a way that they would reflect radar beams away from their source, thus reducing its RCS return by several magnitudes. I'm definitely simplifying here, but that was the basic theory at least, and as strange as it sounded, and certainly looked when Overholser first drew concepts for such an aircraft, his idea began to gain support within Skunk Works. Overholser would pull Schroeder out of retirement, recruiting him to develop a computer program to accurately predict the RCS return of an aircraft, the program being completed in just 5 weeks and named Echo 1. Some of you might be expecting to hear the name of Soviet scientist Peter Umfimtsev somewhere around here, and perfecting Echo 1 is his contribution to stealth aircraft. You see, the original Echo 1 program was pretty shit at predicting RCS returns, mainly due to a phenomenon I'm not qualified to explain called diffraction, but an unclassified paper by Umfimtsev on the subject helped the Skunks complete the program, and his paper would play a near identical role in Northrop's stealth program. Even with this fix, Echo 1 was not perfect, and the limited power of computers in 1975 restricted calculations to 2 dimensions, meaning all their designs ended up looking like something out of a poorly rendered N64 game. Nonetheless, Overholser and his team drew some 20 faceted designs, using Echo 1 to predict their RCS returns, and by May 1975, Overholser presented Ben Rich with a faceted aircraft which would gain the nickname Hopeless Diamond. A not-so-subtle nod to the heart attack the aerodynamics experts at Skunk Works must have had when they learnt of the design. Overholser argued that the plane would have an RCS return smaller than the size of a bird's eye, while Kelly Johnson would call Ben Rich, quote, a dumb shit for even considering the design. But eventually, Overholser would annoy his colleagues enough that the faceted plane was pursued so he would shut up about it. And thus, the Nighthawk began to take shape. Skunk Works would start by building 2 1/3 scale models of the Hopeless Diamond, one to test its aerodynamics and the other to test its RCS returns. Over the next year, these models would catapult the Hopeless Diamond from one man's low-polygon fever dream to the frontrunner for the first stealth fighter design, the Faceted model passing every test set by DARPA with flying colors, and beating out competition from Boeing and Northrop as part of the experimental survivable testbed program. Boeing would drop out of the stealth plane pursuit in October 1975, while Lockheed and Northrop would refine their designs for military testing by March. Heading to the land of meth and fried chicken, the Hopeless Diamond began turning heads in the military, especially after the model had a lower RCS return than the pole it was mounted on, prompting an annoyed Air Force to tell Skunk Works to design a new pole that also had a low RCS return, which they did and pissed them off even more. It should be noted at this point though that both the military and Lockheed had found that the Hopeless Diamond wasn't completely invisible on radar, and at lower frequencies it was detectable, though giving a return about the size overhauls are predicted, but it was considered a calculated risk that the aircraft would be safe from Soviet air defenses. Ultimately, however, the Hopeless Diamond would crush the Northrop design in testing, and the Have Blue program would be officially launched on April 26, 1976, receiving $10.4 million from Lockheed and another $20 million from the government for two prototype highly maneuverable stealth planes, HB-1001, a flight handling testbed, and HB-1002, a stealth demonstration testbed. The most important part of the program was maintaining the low RCS return of the aircraft, necessitating a brand new design for stealthy engine inlets and exhausts, while literally everything else was sacrificed in order to keep the plane as undetectable as possible. So much so that the resulting Have Blue aircraft was unflyable without its fly-by-wire system ripped from the F-16. In fact, the majority of the aircraft systems were just plucked straight from the production lines of existing aircraft, including the F-111, B-52, F-15, and F-18 in order to save money, including even the General Electric J-85 engines which came from the T-2B Buckeye. Despite numerous difficulties during development, including the usual interdepartmental rivalries in the military, a strike by Lockheed machinists, and several issues with the aircraft itself, HB-1001 first flew on schedule on December 1, 1977, just 20 months after the contract was awarded. The second prototype would fly in July of the next year, but not before the first had crashed after 36 flights, and in less than a year, the Have Blue aircraft had proven its invulnerability against every radar system the United States could get its hands on. Have Blue would conclude by the end of 1979, surpassing all of the program's major goals, but by then, the Faceted aircraft was already well on its way to military service. Up until the HB-1002 RCS tests, half the Pentagon thought the Skunks were geniuses that had revolutionized aerial warfare, and the other thought they were delusional con artists. But following these tests, during which Ben Rich literally told them where to aim and they still couldn't find the aircraft, the value of the Skunk stealth technology was beginning to be realized. The program had been classified to the same levels as the Manhattan Project by 1977, creating a classic bureaucratic shitshow for Lockheed to get everyone cleared to work on the stealth program. And before the first Have Blue aircraft even took to the skies, the Air Force was itching to exploit the new advantage of invisible planes. In November 1977, the F-117 program would officially begin, mainly composed of veterans of the Have Blue program and codenamed Senior Trend, this program eventually yielding billions for a struggling Lockheed. Security remained incredibly tight, so much so that many people working on the project had no idea what they were actually building. Nonetheless, the Have Blue design was refined by late 1979, the aerodynamics, which were still traumatizing Skunk Works engineers, being the main focus of the refinements, and even with all their work, the F-117 still flew like a jet-propelled fridge. The low RCS characteristics would also remain a priority, incorporating a radar-absorbing paint among other improvements, but it was far from smooth sailing. The 1979 oil crisis and a boom in civil aviation production would severely affect the manpower and material procurement of the program, while the radar-absorbing paint just inexplicably stopped working one day. that last problem being the result of the paint's manufacturer changing how they made it and deciding to keep that to themselves. All these problems within the program delayed the first flight from 1980 to 1981, and even after testing got underway at Area 51, the fridge-like handling of the F-117 would require even more improvements to the aircraft. Eventually though, testing of the new aircraft was in full swing, and following yet another crash, this time the first production F-117A in 1982, along with more upgrades to the avionics, the F-117 would reach initial operational capabilities in 1983, and the faceted flying machine was ready to take on the world. Before we get to the combat record of the Nighthawk, I should probably explain what the F-117 actually does. You see, despite what the name would suggest, the F-117 doesn't fight other planes. It's exclusively a ground attack aircraft, carrying a grand total of 2 laser-guided bombs. But even this isn't as simple as it sounds. Unlike a regular bomber, the F-117A weapon delivery system guides the aircraft onto the optimal flight path after a target is designated by the pilot, with the aircraft releasing its laser-guided bombs at the optimal time, and the pilot only giving the aircraft permission to fire, the bomb bay doors only opening to immediately drop the ordnance to keep the faceted shape intact. As Colonel Alton Whitley so eloquently put it, the goal of the plane was simply to slip inside hostile territory, drop its 2 bombs, and get the hell out of there. But it would take several years before the Nighthawk would get the chance to do so. The operational story of the F-117 begins at Area 51's bigger brother, the Tonopah Test Range, better known by its very imaginative name, Area 52, where the aircraft would spend 5 years operating in complete secrecy. Flying exclusively at night, this shroud of secrecy was nearly broken with 3 tragic crashes across 1986 and 87, one of which would kill 9 civilians, though it wasn't an F-117 itself which caused the deaths in the latter accident. The next year, after nearly a decade of media speculation surrounding an aircraft known as the F-19, possibly caused by fake accusations of mismanagement by a disgruntled Lockheed employee, and certainly popularized by the iconic model toy aircraft, the F-117 was revealed to the public in November 1988, stunning the world with its unorthodox design. Any doubts about its combat effectiveness would be obliterated over the next few years as the aircraft was deployed on its first missions, beginning with the ironically titled Operation Just Cause. Opening up the completely uncontroversial conflict, the Nighthawk would be employed to precisely bomb critical Panamanian military targets. But since Panama had fuck all in the way of air defenses, the stealth capabilities of the F-117 still remained untested against an enemy. Luckily, with George H.W. Bush in office, the US had no shortage of people they were ready to bomb, and once Saddam Hussein began his oil crusade against Kuwait, the Skunks would get their vindication. 1,247. That's how many sorties F-117s flew during Desert Storm, making up just 1% of all coalition sorties, but destroying 40% of all strategic targets during the campaign without suffering a single loss. If America's enemies weren't afraid of stealth before, they would be after Desert Storm. Nighthawks opening the air campaign again with a bombing of Baghdad, and the Iraqis, even with modern air defenses, never saw it coming, along with a spectacular display of precision when an F-117 dropped a bomb down the air shaft of the Iraqi Defense Ministry on live TV. Round 1 of Bush vs. Hussein ended with the F-117 destroying countless critical targets while not a single aircraft suffered any damage whatsoever. As the 90s progressed, the Nighthawk remained active, seeing use in Operation Southern Watch out of Saudi Arabia, along with in Allied exercises over South Korea and the Netherlands. As had become a staple of the Nighthawk program, improper installation of parts and pilot fatigue caused 2 more crashes by the latter half of the decade. Throughout all these years though, the F-117A had never even been close to suffering a combat loss. That was until the Balkans decided to start killing each other again. Ethnic violence is the favoured pastime of the Balkans, and there is way too much history surrounding all that than is really necessary for me to cover. But as the Kosovo War kicked off in 1998, the F-117 was again brought in to stealthily bomb the belligerents. Since bombing Europe is less palatable to Western politicians than bombing the Middle East, political interference in NATO operations in the Balkans resulted in F-117s using much more simplistic and restricted tactics in their operations, and a combination of complacency and good intelligence on behalf of NATO and Serbia respectively would see a grand total of one F-117 shot down and another supposedly damaged during Operation Allied Force. As much as every common idiot loves to use the only enemy downing of a stealth plane as proof of the follies of such technology, it's important to note that there were some 760 F-117 sorties flown during the course of a war, and it wasn't for a lack of trying that only one Nighthawk was shot down. Regardless, by the turn of the millennium, the black-clad icon of the 80s was becoming obsolete, especially as the F-22 Raptor program was nearing completion. And in fact, the US had made no effort to prevent its enemies from recovering the wreckage of Vega 31, the F-117 shot down over Serbia precisely because they knew the technology was now dated. When the bell rang for the sequel of Bush vs. Hussein in 2003, the Nighthawk was noticeably less utilized, flying less than 100 sorties, mostly just to test the new EGBU-27 bunker buster, which it did with its characteristic surgical precision. Iraq would be the Nighthawk's last combat deployment. It had always been a massive headache to maintain, and its costs continued to mount into the early 2000s, ultimately pushing its retirement date from 2011 to 2008 to accommodate for the new F-22. Between 2006 and 2008, 37 of the 59 Nighthawks were retired, the remaining aircraft used primarily for training and testing purposes. The last remaining Nighthawks are slowly being retired a few at a time, with the program set to end completely sometime in the 2030s, though most are being stored in good enough condition to potentially be brought back into service. In the end, the F-117 finished its military service with thousands of sorties under its belt, and just one combat loss across them all. By the time the Nighthawk retired, the gamble on the stealth plane had more than paid off for Lockheed, though exactly how much is unclear, and the efforts made by the Skunks in the field of stealth in the 1970s continue to turn a profit for Lockheed Martin to this day. The F-117 is an undeniable icon of the late 20th century, and the profile of the black-clad faceted stealth plane truly is one of a kind. Nothing else looks quite like it, nor will another aircraft ever emulate its design, though that probably is a relief to every aerospace engineer on the planet. The Nighthawk, while not completely invincible against radar, proved the merits of stealth technology in every test and in every combat mission it flew, suffering one loss over the course of thousands of sorties between the late 80s and early 2000s, and the lessons learned from its creation have birthed the F-22 and F-35, two aircraft even harder to detect than the Nighthawk. Even the B-2 Spirit owes some lineage to the F-117, being developed by the Northrop team the original Hopeless Diamond design had beaten out. Don't let the likes of Elon Musk fool you. Stealth is a terrifying thing to behold, and the fact that the F-117 is still better at stealth than the modern attempts of Russia and China demonstrate just how groundbreaking Lockheed's strange-looking faceted plane truly was. Just as armor evolves and weapons evolve, stealth will continue to evolve. And if the technological leap between the Nighthawk and the Raptor is anything to go by, stealth technology will remain a staple of American fighter aircraft for decades to come. Unless some idiots keep rallying against it with their AI cameras and drone shows, but I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Regardless of how you feel about stealth, the impact the F-117 has had on the world of military aviation is immense, with Ben Rich receiving a medal from the Defense Department for his work on Have Blue in 1981, and the F-117 itself receiving the 1989 Collier Award. Even though it has since been surpassed by more modern stealth designs, the Nighthawk is a unique and strangely beautiful stealth aircraft. And as the only stealth aircraft in service until the turn of the millennium, the father of stealth planes is still in a league of its own. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. It really means the most. As usual, I've had to cut certain things out for the sake of time, and if you're interested in learning more about the F-117, the sources I've used are linked below. In addition, I've linked 2 Laserpig videos as well if you're interested in the details surrounding stealth, and specifically regarding the Nighthawk. That's all I've got for now. I hope everyone has a great holiday season, and I'll see you all in the next one.